Welcome to another adventure, Tales of the Soul's Conquest of Evil by Heinrich Zimmer. We are within the cycle of the 4 romances of King Arthur, specifically in the Lancelot romance. Today we will watch the 3rd episode of Lancelot. I hope you have the opportunity to follow along with the reading and that you're enjoying this journey to the magical universe, which is the universe of Arthurian mythology. This is the story of Lancelot, which, personally, I like the most. I find it very rich in meaning, very beautiful. Today, we will talk about the only occasion when Lancelot was with another woman other than his beloved queen, Guinevere, to whom he was bound by a somewhat unhealthy passion which proved fatal for himself and his journey as a knight. Well, just to recap a bit, remember that in our last conversation we had the knight Balin, who was the first to wield the sword that would later belong to Lancelot and eventually to his son, Galahad. We saw that the knight Balin dealt a painful blow to a king who was considered extremely virtuous. Imagine that this painful blow Balin dealt was not against an external king, but against what he held most valuable and virtuous within himself. It was a blow against his own wisdom, against his own virtue. And this painful blow caused him a loss from which he never recovered. And it led to his death. His ferocity, his violence, prevailed over his good judgment, his discernment, and the noble feelings he possessed, as every Arthurian knight did. Here, Lancelot, we will see that he too will be struck. He wields the same sword and is also a victim of another blow. Painful, which is the blow of losing control over one's passions. He spends his entire life bound by a passion for Queen Guinevere, the wife of his king, Arthur. He meets her when he escorts her, still a bride, to the wedding, and there he is overtaken by a passion completely beyond his will. A will that never allows him to unite with any woman. But there was an exception. We are going to tell exactly the story of this exception. On one occasion, Lancelot had just finished battling with Tristan, that Tristan of Isolde, which is another very interesting Arthurian cycle. The cycle of Tristan and Isolde. I mentioned to you, even in the last lecture, that Tristan and Lancelot have something very strong in common. Both love a woman married to their king. And both are slaves to this feeling that never ceases, this passion that never ends. And the two face each other, and precisely because they live the same drama, neither of them can be victorious. They end the fight in a draw, where the two fraternize and exchange weapons. After this battle against Tristan, Lancelot decided to set off, wandering through the kingdom in search of adventures. In truth, what happened was that Lancelot was fleeing from Camelot, avoiding meeting the queen, to resist temptation. So he wandered, traveling to the 4 corners of the known world, seeking heroic deeds, seeking challenges. On one occasion, he approached a place where there was a curse. A dragon, a gigantic serpent, that lived inside a sort of sepulchre. A sepulchre within a tomb, it would periodically emerge from there and devastate the region, killing countless people. But there was a prophecy. The prophecy said that one day a knight so strong would pass by. A leopard who would defeat that serpent and give rise to the lion, which is an enhancement of the leopard with the nobility of a king. In other words, what did this prophecy mean? That one day Lancelot would pass by, defeat that serpent, as he is the leopard, and he would unite with the local princess, and together they would give birth to the most perfect of knights. Galahad, who would be the lion, the one destined to conquer the Grail. Then begins a wonderful part of the Arthurian cycle, which is the quest for the Holy Grail. Lancelot was not the right man for this, he was just the leopard. It was necessary for the lion to be born. When he passes through that region and hears about this monster, driven by his desire for adventures, he goes there. He sees the prophecy written on the tombstone, and yet, he removes the tombstone, and the dragon emerges from within. And the two engage in a fierce battle, where he ultimately kills the dragon. When he is exhausted, fallen, recovering from the battle, the king of those lands appears, who is King Pelles. It's interesting that this King Pelles bears some resemblance, in certain aspects, to the last king we saw in Balaam's adventure. He resembles King Pelles. He was also a very noble king, very virtuous, and he possessed some powers, with a very special characteristic. He was the heir of Joseph of Arimathea, who, according to tradition, was the character who would have taken the chalice of the Last Supper, the Grail, to the lands of Britain. Therefore, he was a descendant of Joseph of Arimathea and the guardian of the Holy Grail. It's interesting because you'll see that there was a combination of these two characters, Pelles and Pelles, to form Amfortas, who, in the myth of Parsifal and Faldivo, Frambo and Zemba, is the one who guarded the Grail, but at the same time was wounded by the painful blow. So, when King Pelles arrives, he sees that the dragon has been slain. He approaches Lancelot and treats him very kindly. He was a young nobleman, heir to a king, King Van of Benoic, and he treats him as a noble, inviting him to his castle. And he thinks, well, the first part of the prophecy has been fulfilled. But this knight, as enamored as he is with Queen Guinevere, will never lie with my daughter to produce the grandson I need, to fulfill the most important part of the prophecy. He takes Lancelot, orders that he be bathed, and brings him to a banquet, but at the same time he is worried. This man will surely leave tomorrow, and the prophecy will remain unfulfilled. There was a young woman there, however, who was known as the greatest sorceress of that historical moment. A young woman named Brises approaches the king privately and says, "Your Majesty, do you wish for this man to spend a night with your daughter?" He says, "Well, of course I do. Everyone in this kingdom is waiting, so you can trust that I will create the conditions to fulfill your wish." The king is a bit puzzled because he finds it somewhat impossible, but he lets her proceed. Pelles is also endowed with his powers, his intuition. He knew that Lancelot had pledged his love to Guinevere and would never consciously unite with another woman. Well, in the middle of the dinner, this lady then rises. She announces among the guests that Queen Guinevere of Camelot was quite nearby, just a few miles away. He had gone to stay and explore the castle of Chiesi. And upon hearing this, Lancelot becomes very excited and plans, after finishing the dinner, to immediately ride towards his queen. And so he does. The banquet comes to an end. He bids farewell to the guests and immediately mounts his horse, heading towards the castle of Chiesi. Upon arriving there, who was already there, disguised once again, was Brises, the sorceress. And when he arrives and asks where the queen is, she leads him to the queen's chambers. In fact, it was Elaine who was there. And before he enters, she offers him a glass of wine. This glass of wine contained a magical potion that made him intoxicated and unconscious, enough to not realize who the woman was, the one he would be with. He then takes the cup. He enters the room, a dark chamber with the windows shut, and he joins Elaine, not realizing that his queen, Guinevere, was not there. They spend the night together, and on that very night, Elaine conceives the one who will become Galahad. But in the morning, when Lancelot gets up and opens the curtains, the spell breaks, and he returns to his senses. When he looks back, he sees that the woman who was with him in bed was not Guinevere. He becomes enraged and threatens to kill her. She pleads for mercy and says she is the daughter of King Pelles and that her father had asked her to do it. She offered her virginity to conceive the perfect man, the man destined to achieve the Grail. That young knight, the most perfect there would be in the world, according to the prophecy. She asks him to leave as quickly as possible, and he does so, quite embarrassed by the situation, but he takes his armor, mounts his horse, and leaves the place. And Elaine stays. After some time, the long-awaited baby, Galahad, the destined young one, is born. This story spreads across the kingdoms, and Guinevere learns that a son of Lancelot has been born. Lancelot explains to her that he had been deceived by a spell, but even so, it leaves her very jealous, because Lancelot had been with another woman. Some time passes. Not long after, Elaine and her entourage decide to visit the kingdom of Camelot. And then she enters through the gates of the castle. Everyone is amazed because there was no young woman more beautiful than Elaine. Lancelot himself acknowledges him. There was no young woman more beautiful and wise. It is said that, at that time, there was no young woman with more wisdom than Elaine. She enters, greets Guinevere, and stays at the castle. And Guinevere becomes very upset, and she arranges with Lancelot for him to spend that night in her chambers, so that she would know he wouldn't be with Elaine. Once again, Brises, knowing that his lady, Elaine, was hopelessly in love, Lancelot arranges for that night to be spent in her company and not the Queen's. She goes to Lancelot's chambers, pretending to be a maid of Queen Guinevere. She calls him, takes him to Elaine's chambers, and once again he stays with that lady, unaware, believing he was in the arms of the Queen. In the middle of the night, while sleepwalking, he starts talking loudly, and he begins to speak about his love for Guinevere. And Guinevere, who was in the room next door, recognizes his voice, hears it, and wakes up, starting to cough. He, recognizing her cough, wakes up and once again realizes he had been deceived. Then she enters her room and tells him that he is banished from Camelot, that she never wanted to see him again. He becomes so maddened by the Queen's declaration that he collapses to the floor and runs to one of the rooms, throwing himself out the window. And down below, he falls onto a pile of thorns. He gets badly hurt and runs off, like a madman on foot, unconscious, losing his mind over the terrible fact of being rejected by the woman he loved. Helene reproaches the Queen for having done that, because it shows that he had gone mad and that, therefore, both of them had lost him. And he leaves there as soon as possible. And so time goes by. Some time passes until, at a certain moment, Lancelot, wandering like a beggar, completely deranged. Living like an animal, he unconsciously ends up near the forest of King Pel's castle and collapses there. And then Elaine, with her ladies-in-waiting, pass by and see the young man collapsed, disfigured like an animal, wandering and deranged. And Helene is deeply saddened by this. She and Brises go and speak with King Pels. Brises ensures that he remains asleep for another hour. The king forms a small entourage where some men carry Lancelot to the tower of his castle. Exactly in that tower of King Pel's castle, the Grail was kept. He was the heir of this sacred relic. He asks a priest, he lays Lancelot beside the stand, where it was, the pedestal, where the Grail was, and asks the priest to uncover the Grail. Automatically, the power of the sacred jewel heals Lancelot of all his unconsciousness, of all his madness. When he awakens, he is fully conscious again, but his body is very injured, greatly worn from the way he had been living. He stays there for 15 days in bed, suffering various pains, until he recovers. When he recovers, he turns to Elaine and asks her to arrange for him to stay there, in the kingdom of King Pels, because he never intended to return to the kingdom of Camelot. And she manages to do that. Then, King Pels, prompted by his daughter, grants Lancelot a castle, the castle of Blian, known as the Isle of Happiness, Iona. Because in this castle, surrounded by a river on all sides. There were the most ideal conditions for a man to live happily, and even more so when he had by his side a woman who loved him as much as Elaine loved Lancelot. He retreats there, surrounded by the woman who loved him, surrounded by maidens, by knights who guard him, and spends 15 years there. Happy years, yes, but always shadowed by the anguish of missing the queen. At certain times of the day, he would stop and remain silent, gazing in the direction of Camelot. And everyone knew what he was thinking about. At a certain moment, he asked to be called, from then on, the knight who transgressed, referring to his betrayal of Guinevere. And for Elaine, it was a great sadness to have to treat him in this way. And he insisted on being treated that way. This anguish, which lingered even amidst the happiness of 15 years, ceased when, on a certain day, 2 knights of the Round Table came by to fetch him, by order of Queen Guinevere, who was also dying of longing. Guinevere asks him to come with these knights, and he, more quickly than anything, disregards all the love of those who surrounded him. From there, he arms himself, mounts his horse, and sets off once more towards Camelot. After returning to Camelot and continuing his devotion to Queen Guinevere, Lancelot, now older, finds himself involved with another. Almost a romance, with another Elaine, the second Elaine in his life. This is curious because you'll notice that he fights with Tristan, and Tristan is almost like a reflection. He lives the same drama. In the same way that, for Tristan, there were 2 Iona, the second Isolde of his life, the Isolde of the white hands. For Lancelot, there also appears a second Elaine, the Elaine of the white hands, Elaine the White, who was the daughter of a knight, Bernard of Castillon. And this Bernard invites all the knights from that region, the greatest, to engage in a battle to see who was the most fearless warrior, the best in combat. And Lancelot presents himself, and soon his daughter falls in love with him, even though he is no longer a young man. His daughter, the beautiful Helena of Castillon, asks him to fight. Carrying her handkerchief, she would be the lady for whom he fought. This was very common. The knights would carry a lattice handkerchief and fight in her name. In the same way, Lancelot felt a bit shy about refusing. After all, she was the princess of those lands. He also knew that Guinevere would be present, and that he couldn't fight with another lattice handkerchief, in the name of another lady, in the presence of Queen Guinevere. Then he receives from the Lord of the Lands, Bernard of Castillon, the shield of his other son, Helene's brother, so that he would not be recognized, and fights with a cloak that concealed his identity. He fights with Helene's handkerchief. He battles and emerges victorious over all the knights of the Round Table and all the others who present themselves there. Remember that Lancelot is characterized by being destined never to be defeated. So he defeats them all. At a certain moment, when he fights the last warrior, who was a young man, newly admitted to the Round Table, who was Bower, he also defeats Bower, but is seriously wounded. Interesting, because this Bower was a pure knight, who will later accompany Galahad in the quest for the Grail. And perhaps he didn't have the necessary experience to fight Galahad, but his purity makes him the most difficult of knights to be defeated, and inflicts a significant wound on Lancelot. After the battle, Lancelot, wounded, is taken to a cave where there was an old knight willing to tend to him. But Elaine goes to her father and says, "I want him to be treated, in my chambers, by me." And her father grants this. Lancelot, unconscious, is taken to her chambers and she takes care of him. When he recovers, he turns to her. He thanks her profusely and asks if she wants him to pay her for the care she gave him. Elaine, deeply hurt and wounded, because she evidently loved him and did not hide it, tells him that she wanted absolutely nothing from him and that he should leave at that very moment. And he, even knowing that she loved him, a beautiful young woman, yet another princess in his life, doesn't think twice. Once again, he mounts his horse and heads towards Camelot. Helene is deeply hurt, very wounded by this. After Lancelot's departure, in 10 days, she dies of love, disappointed at having been so rejected by the love of her life. And then she is placed on a barge and floats down the river, which leads to Camelot. When her body arrives, she is a beautiful lady, lying on a barge, holding a lily in one hand and a letter in the other. Everything was done exactly as she requested. She was placed on that barge with a lily in one hand and, in the other, a letter. When she arrives in Camelot, everyone notices the young woman's beauty. They take on the duty of burying her. She is known as the Lady of the Lily. But when they take the letter in her hand, what they open is a love letter to Lancelot. Where she spoke of her immense love for which she had given her life, Lancelot feels a bit embarrassed by the story. He tells everyone what had happened, and she is buried. Once again, he misses the chance to be with a lady who loved him madly. Let's talk a little about the symbolism of all this. Further on, for those who enjoy literature related to the Arthurian myth, Elaine of Castellon became known as the Lady of Camelot. And with that name, Tennyson, the poet, dedicated a beautiful poem to her. And several painters dedicated various paintings. I draw attention to the painting by John William Waterhouse, which bears exactly this title, Lady of Camelot. A truly beautiful painting. It was a theme always much remembered, the lady of the book, the lady who gives her life for love. Zimmer continues to comment on this, noting a curious detail. We are in the midst of the Middle Ages, and the moralism of the time is very strict. It goes without saying, but this love affair between Lancelot and a married lady, who is Guinevere, doesn't provoke much moral criticism, as one might expect. Throughout the Middle Ages, it was understood that the love between the two was not really a choice, but an imposition, a mad passion that united them. The two were doomed to that love, and as if condemned, bewitched, he had no other chance. And that's why Lancelot becomes such an important character in the universal imagination. Instead of becoming a mere adulterer of the king, who loved and esteemed him so much, a traitor to the king, he becomes a man bewitched and whose life was destroyed by a forbidden love. And in this way it is accepted, and in this way Cruz y Sus of the story, the most gallant and chivalrous of all the knights of the Round Table. Although he was not the predestined one, he was a character who stood out for his strength and gallantry. Now take a moment to imagine something interesting, because the entire Arthurian myth is filled with symbols, like any great myth. And, primarily, the axis is the axis of Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot. As we mentioned on another occasion, if we take the three worlds, the Greek representation of the three worlds, we have nous, which is the spiritual element of man, the noblest element, psyche, which is the element of emotions, of concrete thoughts, and soma, which is the physical and energetic body of man. Man would be composed of these three centers. And, in fact, the psyche is often represented by a female character. In this case, it's Guinevere. Imagine Lancelot, who is connected to the physical plane, being a child of water and not of fire, would not be able to understand the nobility of a king like Arthur. Arthur was the very symbol of spirituality, of absolute nobility. There's only one way to understand Arthur and to see Arthur, and that's through the psyche itself. There is no way to see God when we are not at the level for a deeper vision. We see God within us, through his attributes in our psyche, our highest feelings, our highest thoughts. And so it is. Imagine the following: if Guinevere were not a queen, if Guinevere were not Arthur's bride, when Lancelot met her, surely Lancelot would not love her. He loved Arthur through her. Through her, it was the little he perceived of Arthur. And he, through this symbol of the spiritual, which was Guinevere, instead of creating a transition element to help him understand the spiritual, he generates a passion. He becomes fatally attached to her and sees nothing beyond her. This love for Guinevere, turned into an obsessive passion, causes Lancelot not to see the spirit and even betray it. And that's curious. It's quite interesting. How many times in history have we clung to a spiritual ideal that we sense more than we see? We embody this spiritual ideal in a cause, a fraternal cause, a religious cause, a human being who led some cause, a goal of fighting for the underprivileged, for those most in need. And by taking this icon, this symbol, we cling to it so much that we lose any reference to the idea it symbolizes. And we begin to have, in relation to this religious symbol, this political symbol, this social symbol, or human, a relationship of fanaticism. In other words, I no longer fight for humanity, for the poor or the oppressed. I fight for a symbol, for an ideology with which I've developed a fanatical passion and see nothing beyond it. What I intended, which was fraternity, slipped away. I fell in love with something that, at first, symbolized this fraternity. For, as time goes by, my passion generates blindness. I fall in love with the thing itself. I fall in love with this leader and start creating a cult of personality. I fall in love with this historical figure, or this religious figure, or this political figure, or any ideology. And instead of seeing through them a greater idea, a greater ideal, I see nothing else. This generates a fanaticism, a blindness, that is always destructive and fatal. For Lancelot's virtue, for how brave he was, for how loyal he was in battle, for how helpful he was. In relation to all those who needed his sword, he was given other chances in life. He had the chance to reconnect with the divine within himself through a lady who was absolutely idealistic. He wanted nothing more than for his life, for everything he held most precious, to be given. To create a new and better man. Elaine, daughter of King Pelleas, was absolutely selfless. She only wanted through her body to bring forth a new and better man. She wanted to give her life to create a better humanity. She was an idealist. But Lancelot was not able to recognize the divine through Elaine's pure and legitimate idealism. He was not able to see, through her, the possibility of a non-fanatical, clearer access to the idea of the divine itself. He did not recognize her. After that, life. Well, you don't recognize an idealist, a seeking wisdom, a philosopher. Let's consider something a bit smaller. A beautiful lady who offers you a domestic life. Peaceful, comfortable, with children, the life of a normal man, of a good citizen. Who is Evan Helene, from Astolat, who truly loved him and was willing to dedicate her life to him. But he also no longer recognizes the possibility of accessing the divine through this means. And he also denies this lady. He denies a love so great that it couldn't survive his rejection. And he remains trapped in this idolatry. Something that one day we could compare. Guinevere, something that was once a lock. He saw the divine through her. But at another moment, it becomes an object of fanaticism. It becomes an object of idolatry. That through which, at first, he saw Arthur, and, at another moment, it no longer allowed him to see anything else. So, we see Lancelot as the knight, who, in trying to seek the divine through a symbol, loses sight of the divine and turns that symbol into fanaticism. Notice that this is interesting and not uncommon to happen. One thing we always mention in our philosophy course at New Acropolis, and which I use here because I leave this idea of Lancelot. Clearer still is that lesson from the flight of geese, the ducks when they migrate, flying in AV formation. You know that what is meant to overcome air resistance is a lesson in aerodynamics. It's curious because the way they fly, all of them, let's say they are migrating south. All of them, in that V formation, are aware of the leader in front of them. But they also have the vision of the goal, the target. They see the south. This is very different from if they flew in a line, because they would no longer have the vision of the goal, the target. They wouldn't see the south. They would only see the back of the neck of the companion ahead of them. This rather mundane example is very interesting because it's exactly what happens with those who become fanatical. They no longer have the vision of the goal, but only of the symbol that represents the goal in front of them. They don't see the end of the process, but only the one who is ahead of them. Those ideas that go ahead of you, that institution that leads you. And with that, they become blind. And soon, they no longer exchange this leader, who goes ahead, for their own destiny, where they were going. They are capable of following him in any direction. They lose their greater goal. One of the symbols of leadership is the flight of the geese, all of them seeing the destination. What happens with Lancelot is clear. He no longer sees the destination. He no longer sees Avalon. He no longer sees the Grail. He only sees someone who was in front of him. On the path towards the Grail, Iona. And they take it as the goal itself, losing their greater reference point, in such a way that he becomes unworthy of the quest for the Grail. Think about that for a moment. When we cling to intermediaries, we inevitably fall into fanaticism. Anyone who goes ahead of us can be a good guide, but it doesn't free us from the vision of the target towards which we are heading. This is the lesson that Lancelot teaches us today. Neither through idealism nor through true love, he is no longer able to find his own. I am divine. He is no longer able to see it. Life gave him all the opportunities, and he succumbed. Well, we'll stop here for today. And in our next recording, we will see the final episode. From the romance of Lancelot, before we delve further, there is Merlin. Merlin is the next character. Thank you very much, and a hug to all of you.